Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of Carbon Experts Live. This is our live conversation series here at One Click LCA, where we have great conversations with smart people. Very excited about today's guest, Josie Cadwallader-Hughes. She is Sustainability Director at Thakeham, and I'm really excited about today's conversation. We'll be talking about net zero and biodiversity targets, what they mean for house builders, and really what they mean for sustainability in general. If you are in a different industry, I'm sure you'll still get some great insights and takeaways from today's conversation. So while we're getting started, why don't you jump into the chat section, comments if you're joining us on LinkedIn, and let us know where you are viewing from today. We love to see where our audience is calling in from. And so let us know where you're coming from. My name is Aileen Carroll. I am the Demand Generation Specialist for One Click LCA in North America. And I'm joined by my co-host today, Travis Dahl, who is Business Developer for North America. How are you doing today, Travis?
Doing great. Thanks for the intro, Aileen.
Absolutely. And of course, we are joined also by Josie. Josie, how are you today?
Very good.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to get into this conversation. But before we start, just a few little housekeeping rules and to let you know how the show is going to go today. We're going to start with covering the main questions with Josie on those net zero and biodiversity targets. And then after the initial conversation, we're going to have time for live Q&A. So if you have any questions that you want discussed, go into the chat, go into the questions tab if you're viewing this on Livestorm. And if you're viewing it on LinkedIn, just go into the comments, let us know your questions. We'll be keeping an eye on those so we can ask Josie at the end. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a few questions of our own. We have a question from last month's guest, Gilbert Lennox King. And Josie, we're going to give you a chance to challenge next month's guest with a question, and that will be Amy Leadham. She'll be joining us in September. So looking at the chat coming in, we've got some folks coming from France, we've got Finland, we've got Ireland, Dubai, Turkey. So we've got people joining us. We've got the UK. We've got people joining us from all over the world. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining. So without further ado, Travis, I'll turn it over to you so you can get the conversation going.
Great. Thanks, Aileen. Well, so as Aileen mentioned, welcome to our 5th episode of Carbon Experts Live. This is One Click LCA's lively discussions with various different experts that are driving forward low carbon construction. So if you've missed any of our previous sessions, you can watch them at our YouTube channel. You can find us at One Click LCA and just search Carbon Experts Live. Our topic today, net zero and biodiversity targets. What do they mean for house builders? No small topic. And yeah, I'm thrilled to be joined today by Josie Cadwallader-Hughes. Quick intro on Josie is she's the Sustainability Director at Thakeham Group, and she's responsible for keeping Thakeham at the leading edge, building partnerships with distinguished organizations with a long history of championing change and advising on a number of cross-industry programs enabling zero carbon placemaking. Thakeham are community creators, and they have a focus on zero carbon infrastructure-led placemaking. So what they're doing is they're leading the industry with the support of distinguished organizations, and the Thakeham sustainability strategy covers themes on climate action, nature recovery, people, and communities. So just to get things kicked off, Josie, can you, I always like to tell people or ask people what your personal story is. How did you get started in sustainable construction? What's your motivations? Where did you start and how did you end up here?
Hey, I'm just going to jump in really quick. Travis, your audio is breaking up a little bit. So you might want to sign off and sign back on, but great question. And Josie, if you want to go ahead and answer it, then we can let Travis rejoin us.
Sure, will do. I'm glad it wasn't just me then. Yeah, the question, what's my personal story and how did I end up working in sustainable construction? Well, actually, my uncles were all engineers, and They all worked in the military, so I thought I'd rebel and go into civil engineering. That was as far as a rebellion as my family could handle. So yeah, had a brain for it. Went to university and it was being taught the same way it had been taught for generations. We were using overhead projections when that was no longer cool for some time. The calculations were the same, the process was the same, and I just couldn't believe that nothing had changed substantially, that we were still relying on the same Victorian formulas, so kind of and over engineering. So one of the modules that we did, it was about the kind of aerodynamics of wind turbine blades, and actually we did like a side module about how you could convert oil platforms and the foundations of those out at sea over to deal with the movement of wind turbines, and because of the aerodynamics of those blades, how you could optimize them. And all of a sudden, this old construction of working out foundation levels for offshore oil platforms, changing that to something that was radically different, was just like, oh my God, that's what I've got to do. I've got to do that because it's always changing. So then, yeah, just went into studying that, and then realized actually, you know, the thing about sustainability is that, you know, doing things radically different is obviously important, but also we need everyone to be doing things differently. It's a kind of a process of getting everyone on board. And house building is that thing. It's that thing that touches everyone's lives. And it's like, what I came to realize through my first job was, well, yes, there's the houses themselves, and a lot of construction companies just focus on the construction process or the house in terms of its energy. And there's so much of a bigger impact that you can have. You know, the next big thing is, you know, it's not just, you know, your life in that house, but it's also how you get to places, how accessible those places are, and what your barriers are to using different forms of transport. That is all affected by that master plan. You know, if all of a sudden it's drastically harder for you to just get in your single occupancy car and drive somewhere where everyone else is also going in their single occupancy car, you have the power as a developer, as a house builder, to affect that. And if you just focused on the construction bit, if you looked at the whole life carbon of a house, the construction phase is less than 1%. It's mad that we're all focusing on that. So, you know, I thought less about, I started thinking less about the civil engineering and the construction process, and more about the broader change that you can, the broader impact that you can have on someone's life. How's your audio, Travis? Eileen, can you hear Travis?
Let's try that now.
There we go.
Is that better?
Yeah, that sounds much better.
Great. Okay. I think it was just my headphones, so I'll have to play with those later. Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Josie. So with our first subtopic, focusing on net zero and biodiversity, obviously that's a huge topic. So we kind of want to focus a little bit. But I guess starting off, how would you define net zero? This has been something that we've been asking a few of our guests, and it's an important topic today. And how would you approach it?
Of course it is, yeah. So we look at our impact on climate change across the whole scope of what we operate in. So everything from the house and how it's designed and how that operates, but taking a step backwards, looking at the materials that go into that, your embodied carbon, your A1 to A5, and then also looking at that tiny little 1%, which is still, you know, that's the one we have the most control over, is the construction phase. And then there's the rest of it, which is our whole emissions. So our net zero strategy, there's 3 commitments. The first is every home that we complete on from 2025 will be net zero carbon. And that means the heating, lighting and cooling, but we're looking at going beyond that. So obviously the regulation, the Future Home Standard, is a 75% improvement. Obviously we're going to 100%, but we're also looking at going beyond that. So that's the house in its operation. The production of it, we've also committed that it will be carbon neutral in production. So looking at that embodied carbon, calculating that as accurately as we can, and then offsetting that. So then there's a financial driver in there. It incentivizes us to reduce that embodied carbon, because then we're not paying so much on offsetting. And then the one that's our business operations. That's the easy one. That's the easy one to kind of certify, and there's really specific standards and consultants that help us with that. We work with Planet Mark, who are a great organisation, and they help us with our scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then we're looking at our scope 3 at the minute. But the way that we're doing that is slightly different. Sorry, I'm getting super into the net zero detail. I will come on to biodiversity, but what we've looked at is, rather, you can get these like weird average numbers in all of these kind of net zero calculations you can do. You can get away with using these just average numbers. And what we found is, like, there's a groundworks contractor. We're not a massive company, but there's a groundworks contractor we spend, a huge amount on every single month. And I would use the same number for the carbon emissions, for our scope 3 emissions, for that person as I would for the timber frame supplier. And to me, that seems like madness. They're obviously different business, obviously using different amounts of carbon emissions. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go, right, you know what we can do? Look at the top 10 people that we spend money with, and let's talk to them. Because in reality, my scope 3 is not going to be right until I know that my groundworks contractors that we work with most have a net zero strategy, and they have a commitment to be carbon neutral by a certain date. And if we can do, I think we're small enough, we're agile enough to be able to have that conversation with them. In a certain way, I'm kind of lucky that we're not like a massive national company that I can go, okay, let's do the top 10. Let's just go and talk to them. So net zero is house, production, operational emissions as a business. The biodiversity one, for us, there's biodiversity net gain, which is some legislation that's being brought in with the Environment Bill in November. And what that will commit us to is a 10% increase in biodiversity from before we started on site to when we finished. And we set that commitment internally back in 2020. And I think we're only one of 2 house builders that have had that commitment. So really proud of that, and looking at ways of going beyond it, which I'm sure we'll get onto.
So you mentioned, I want to dig into A1 to A5 just a little bit, because from what I've seen, when I look at models, usually the majority of the emissions is from A1 to A3, and I think as in the LCA industry as a whole, like that's where a lot of the focus is. When it comes to modeling, I think A4 is not such a difficult thing, but how do you approach A5, and are there, like, how much of a piece of the picture do you find that is, and what are some of the challenges when it comes to modeling those details?
It's all super tricky. We recently released a document that we called a white paper that was essentially, we'd gone through 2 house types, the same one that we'd built in brick and same one that we'd built in timber, and we ran it through the calculations. We ran a workshop with all of our departments that were involved in that design process. And in that white paper, we released a bunch of problems, basically, where we kind of went, we're really lucky that we're not tied in by those kind of regulatory frameworks where we're just trying to provide a number. We're trying to provide the right number. So sometimes it means that we have the freedom to be a bit more, honest about how we feel like the results went. And there's one thing that coming together with the process, and obviously A5 can be tricky, but like one of the outcomes that we had was that we're already achieving the Letty-Reba 2030 target for embodied carbon, and we haven't done anything about it yet. How can we be achieving the 2030 target if we haven't even done anything to actively change the embodied carbon? So I think, there are challenges and problems throughout it. The other one that always winds me up is around some of the materials that are like our highest carbon intensity, like bricks. Is that the reality on one of our sites is that the bricks are coming from 10 minutes down the road, which should be great. That's where they're fired. That's where the raw material is taken out of the ground. But I don't have the EPD for that product. So I have to use the generic average red brick. And my problem with that is then if I'm trying to compare myself to another house builder, we're all comparing with the same product. The only way that I would have a lower embodied carbon than the developer next door is if I had fewer bricks rather than the choice. It's all about, I need my specification manager to make an informed choice. And without some of those details, it's so hard. So we released that document about a month ago, called the Next Big Carbon Challenge. So obviously we've tackled, we all know what net zero carbon homes look like. The Next Big Carbon Challenge, once you've dealt with that, is embodied carbon. So that's out there for anyone to read.
So if I can jump in there, when you talk about net zero in this context, we're talking operational predominantly, not embodied carbon.
Sorry, say that again.
So in this definition, when you say we're achieving net zero, we're talking about operational emissions,
the operational emissions of the house. Yeah, there's zero. That's a zero carbon home. Then there's the production of that house, the A1 to A5, and within that, obviously you've got that A5 bit, the construction bit in there. That that gets trapped in with being a carbon neutral business. So that one, that one's probably the easiest to attribute and get a certification for so far. But the rest of it is carbon neutral, whereas that one is net zero.
Mm-hmm. And with the with the bricks as well, I think that's an interesting topic. Just and exposes one of the challenges that we have in the LCA space right now, where a manufacturers the manufacturers do not have EPD data for their products, and I would think in this case it would be something that would be really beneficial for them as a company.
Yeah, my suspicion is that there might be a gap between that average red brick that we're all using and what the reality is, and that might be where there's some hesitation. But also there's a load of myths out there about how long it takes to make an EPD and how much it costs. I think I've heard it costs 15 grand to make an EPD and it takes 3 years. And the fact is that's just not true. EPD production, whether it's One Click LCA with their support or not, that's just not true. So, and the only other thing to consider, and we did go when we were doing this white paper, we went to the Brick Development Association, who are the people that kind of own the average red brick calculation, and spoke to them and said, look, what's the concern? Are you pushing your members to release this data? And the impression that I got is the bit that they're worried about is the heritage producers, which I can totally respect. They're most likely the ones with the oldest technology, the ones that don't have the infrastructure, the ability to invest huge amounts in solar or transitioning away from gas. And I can totally appreciate that. We have that same issue across many other sort of heritage construction material production. There's got to be some way of supporting that industry coming forward, and that's the statement that we put in the report from them, was about finding a way to support heritage production but also deliver on these bold ambitions.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned with the LEDI 2030 targets that the goal that we're aiming to hit in 7 years, and you guys are already achieving that. What do you think is the reason for that? Do you think it's are the targets not high enough? Is it something that you're doing that's special? What is it?
No, I don't think it's something that we're doing that's special. I think any house builder should be able to achieve it, and we're really clear on that. I think probably what it is that there isn't enough low-rise data in there to inform those benchmarks. So that's one of the benefits of making EPD data or whole life carbon assessments something that you have to submit that then gets sent as part of a benchmarking system that helps continually inform that. And I know the Carbon Trust are working on something quite similar. And I think that's crucial. The Future Homes Hub have done some great work on it in the UK, but I think it's been driven by some of the benchmarks. The data that they've got in has been from high rise, and we've got a huge benefit. We're not using massive amounts of steel and concrete, so naturally we're going to be below that. So I think we just need continual input to inform those, and that does mean that people have got to start creating these assessments. They've got to start submitting them. Our deadline is for 2025, but that's obviously we've been working on it for a few years already. So confidently we could submit every single house type with a whole life carbon assessment, or at least the A1 to A5, and know that it was good enough to tick the boxes. But I think our hesitation is we want to make sure that it's the right brick that's in there and that we're doing things effectively, and we want to make sure it's right, because otherwise it's not going to be able to drive what our business decides to do.
So with when it comes to ticking boxes and policy mandated targets, how are you approaching some of these targets?
I mean, fundamentally, we took quite a radical change 3 years ago as a business. That back in 2020, honestly, there weren't any. I think there was one sustainability commitment, and it was about hedgehog highways in every fence. That was it. And the business decided that actually this was the way to differentiate ourselves from other house builders, because nothing had significantly changed, really.
Sorry, Josie, can you define a hedgehog highway?
Okay, right. So hedgehog numbers in the UK have dropped by something like, someone will correct me on this, but I think it's about 75% since the 1970s. And they're the cutest little things. And a hedgehog highway is literally, well, basically, it's just a hole that's about this big, in your fence line, so that they can cross in the night. So they travel about 3 kilometers a night. If they're penned in, that's not going to happen. They're not going to be able to forage for food. They're not going to be able to find somewhere to nest. They're not going to be able to survive. So a hedgehog highway is super simple and super easy to do as well. So as a first sustainability commitment, when I joined the business, there was you spend time going through all of the folders on the system, right? You go and have a proper nose on here about what they're interested in, what things you can find of stuff that they've done in terms of sustainability. There was an entire folder dedicated to hedgehog photos, and I was like, this is great. So we kind of focused on that when we talk about. We don't really talk about biodiversity internally, like specifically. The first thing that we started talking about was, well, actually, we'd like to see a world where seeing a hedgehog is an everyday experience. That's what we're aiming for. We all get it because we're obsessed by hedgehogs. I think one April Fool's Day, we even changed the Thakeham lion logo to a hedgehog and said that we were only building homes for hedgehogs, no more homes for humans. And it's just like, that's been a great way to engage internally and externally. So yeah, that's a hedgehog highway. But the policy mandated targets, being ahead of those is great to be part of. It sometimes means you jump about a bit. Your definitions have to change in line with what the government says or what the latest advice says. But fundamentally, all you should be focused on is what you're looking for the outcome to be. And if it's you want to see a world where seeing a hedgehog is an everyday experience, you'll find ways of doing that. You can call it biodiversity net gain. You can call it natural capital. You can call it all sorts of stuff. But fundamentally, when we're talking to employees, when I'm talking to the stakeholders in the business, we're talking about it in a way that we can all understand. So, that always results for us in being really bold in those targets, and they always exceed the policy standpoint. And it's not just to be clear, it's not just sustainability on that. I'm really lucky to work for the sort of business that has policies in there like, always being policy compliant for affordable homes. And what that means is if a local authority says, we need our developments to have 25% of them, the homes that you build have to be affordable, we'll always go, yeah, if that's what you say that the local community needs, that's what we'll build. Whereas there's lots of developers out there that will they'll say that they need to reduce that number and deliver fewer affordable homes than what the local authority says is needed. And so, working for an organisation that truly believes that, I think, if you work in sustainability and that's your career choice, you don't go into it to tick boxes. So, my advice would always be bold enough to insist on the business benefits of what you're trying to achieve, or find some company that believes you and that wants to go on that journey with you.
What do you think is the motivation behind setting these more ambitious targets and staying ahead of the curve, even though, as you suggested, there's a risk that you may go in slightly the wrong direction and have to readjust as you move forward, and
Yeah.
I guess, yeah.
So I think what's the reason? While I think this business is a bit unusual, and I can't ever put my finger on what it is. I think, they all realised that employees cared about it more than they realised. They realised that it was something that they could differentiate themselves in tender applications because, or they realised that all local authorities have declared a climate emergency with no idea of how they're going to actually achieve it and meet their obligations to the people living in their communities. There was just so many things that kind of massed together that when we can't not do this. And I think with that, you've got to accept that if you're going to do things a little bit differently, then there is going to be a bit of weaving left and right and kind of trying to figure it out as you go along. And that, no one expected, no one in Thakeham expected this to be something that would just be clear and obvious from day one. But we've had to find things out as we go along, and we've learned some lessons, and what we've settled on is an approach that we think works for everyone. It works for our clients, that those are the ones that are delivering homes for people that are most at risk from fuel poverty. We can talk about it in that regard. We can also talk about I can talk about hedgehogs for days.
For sure. I have so many more questions, but moving on to some of the net zero behavioral change. How is building different from commercial construction? I mean, there are the obvious structural differences and building approaches, but from a net zero perspective, how do you feel that it's different?
Fundamentally, I think it's the client that's the difference. So when we're building a home, someone's going to be living in that. That it's such a big investment for someone, and it's a really emotive decision. And that means that we communicate it in a really different way. We also, so Thakeham build your normal house building developments. We also build as a partnership builder for housing associations and for local authorities, as I said before. So the clients in that regard are organisations or institutions with a long history of homing people and with a really strong duty of care to the lives that they lead. And I think that's also really emotive. So I think it's a different way of talking about sustainability when you're in those different industries. We're less driven by client needs. Sometimes we're on the journey with them. So I spend a lot of time with local authorities or with clients saying, actually, your ambition is this, or it's to tackle fuel poverty, or it's you've declared a climate emergency. Let's break this down. Let me show you the technologies. Let's go and have a look around one of our developments. What can we include on this development that takes you further than what you expected you were going to do before? So it's a great opportunity. It's more personal, I guess. The relationship that I have with clients or our sales teams have with those customers is way more personal, and I think that just changes what we do. Yes, you're right, different materials, but there's way more than that.
Great. And we talked a little bit the other day. Can you tell me the story about developing your zero carbon production policy? I'd love to hear how the journey's been successful, maybe things that are still questionable or you're unsure about, maybe places where you've had to redirect. We won't call them necessarily failures, but you've learned and had to change your direction a little bit. How has this unfolded?
Yeah, I can't remember what we were talking about. Was this about the shed?
I believe it started there.
Yeah, it started there. Okay, fine. So, one of the things that we talked about, that personal journey, and actually, I said like right at the beginning about if you can make it kind of hard for someone to just get in their single occupancy car. And you've got to think about the reality. The houses that we're building aren't necessarily they're not for me, right? They're not for someone that knows what a passive house scheme is and knows the top 10 air source heat pumps of the year, right? It's not for me. It's for my auntie. It's for, you know, my cousins to move into, you know, and there's this real thing of thinking about what their reality is now. So if I said, you know, to my cousin, you've got to cycle to work, that's what the right thing is to do. He'd go, well, A, it's too far away because there isn't any employment space near where I live. I'd say B, the roads are really dangerous. But like the first thing, if I said, right, you know, you have to do it, you know, regardless of where planners have chosen to put things in your vicinity, you've got to do it. His journey that morning would be to have to get up way earlier, to have to go to the bottom of the garden where the shed is, to have to pull out the lawnmower, to get that, to kind of pull it out, to take it up the garden path, down the alleyway, out of the way of the bins, wrestle it to the front, and then realise that he's left his, I don't know, he doesn't know where the key is because he never uses it to the bike lock, or he's left his helmet in the loft or something like that. That would be the reality. And that's the reality that we have to change. And we know that it's not going to happen from day one. Like, we can't deliver developments that just have no car parking. It's a great way to build communities. You know, like some of the strongest new community collaboration I've seen is over just fury about the lack of car parking spaces, right? That's a great way of building communities and a sense of community, really pulling people together. However, there's got to be better ways of doing it. So if we just build developments that have got really restrictive requirements on car parking, for example, and just not having the spaces for those cars, you're not going to be bringing people with you. So we talk about the kind of 2-car comfort blanket. We really believe that, you know, if someone's arriving on our development from day one, then most likely they'll have the same setup they've had at their last home. We can't not expect that to happen. But what we want to get to the point of is that they don't need both cars. And actually the one that they've got can be electric because they've got really easy access to car charging. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible. And then we want to put the cycle parking right at the front and have, you know, bike charging so that they can go further if their employment space isn't within, you know, 15, 20-minute cycle ride. Make it really accessible. That's the point.
I think that's such an important piece. I live in a community that's very difficult to not drive. It's for a variety of different reasons, and we can. I think I like the term like social engineering. I mean, humans we're pretty predictable animals, and we're relatively easy to influence. And by setting up these scenarios where it's easier to take a bike, you're living closer to where you need to be, or the road infrastructure is set up for it. It's easier to get to the bike than the car. And all of the pieces that you need are there. There's storage for your helmet and your lock and so on. Just makes it a lot easier to make that decision.
Yeah, and you know, it's even wider than the house and the garage or the cycle storage. That if the route that they've got actually outside of their front door is the cycle route, and actually it's because we focus so much on biodiversity that's also a kind of green superhighway, if we call it something like that. That actually that's where the hedgerow goes. You're super protected. You've not got to worry about safety concerns or air quality issues. You know, there's so many other side benefits to it. And you know, that's the sort of thing. It's kind of like how I was talking about. Yes, we talk about biodiversity, and we have an amazing set of biodiversity principles that we've worked with some national wildlife charities on that are coming out later this year. But the reality is, it's still that thing of wanting to see a hedgehog every day. This one is we're thinking about that reality and how we can change that reality for people. And the kind of technical bit that goes behind that, yeah, there's loads of it around transport infrastructure, around how you design these homes. But I think that's the thing. We've got to focus on the kind of people aspect, the hedgehog everyday stuff. That's what we've got to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you. Eileen, welcome back.
Yeah, thank you. This is fantastic. I almost felt bad jumping back in here to start the Q&A because this conversation has been so interesting.
I have so many more questions.
I know you do, and I'd love to let you talk for much longer. But we do have quite a few questions from the audience. So we've got some chosen that we want to pose to you, and feel free, to sort of continue the conversation if these questions spark some more conversation between you. So we have our first question here. How do you achieve net zero in buildings during construction and at the same time protect the biodiversity on the site level?
Yeah, so the way that the biodiversity net gain is protected in the new UK legislation is that the earlier that we implement it, the more points it's worth, if I super simplify it. So there's kind of an incentive there for us to start with the green infrastructure. We call it landscape-led placemaking, is that rather than going, okay, road there, houses, because we're working with the existing hedgerows and restoring those. The earlier that we do that, the more benefit there is to us. So that really helps us protect the biodiversity, and obviously working closely with independent ecologists and all of the rest of it is all part of it, as is having something like a construction environmental management plan helps us manage that process. But really, for us, the biodiversity stuff, that the earlier you do it, the better. If I talk to the sales team about it, they want to sell the view. And if that is a muddy pond, it's not going to work for anyone. No one's buying that. So again, establishing that and protecting it as early as possible helps them. And then, achieving the net zero in the buildings, that fabric first approach just means that hopefully I'm taking up less space on a development. The most frustrating thing for me is the gardens. Is we have to, when we're doing biodiversity net gain, when we're doing the calculation, we have to assume that the gardens are basically worthless for biodiversity. And it's such a shame, and I know that some people will move in and put in fake grass, and it honestly, I'm lucky to have not seen it on one of our developments yet, but I see it on new build developments where people have moved in for a no maintenance life. And they do that, and that's the only thing that I wish I could mandate, that all gardens have to be wild, but there we go.
I like that approach. You talk about approaching these earlier, the earlier that we're looking at these issues, the better. And yeah. I've started using the term value engineering from a carbon perspective a lot lately, and it's something that we do a lot in construction, where we approach, looking at ways we can save costs and bringing in as many different people as we can early on in the construction process, or the design process. And when we have the most flexibility, the most ability to make changes, and really the same thing applies when it comes to reducing the carbon on a project. But it would also totally make sense to do the same thing with biodiversity and making sure that we're protecting the natural habitat as much as possible, because the reality is that regardless of what we're doing, we're doing a lot of damage there when we get in there with picks and shovels and excavators and put structures in these spaces. But if we're able to reduce that impact as much as possible, it's a good approach.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's fantastic. Our next question come from Jenna, and her question is, which standards or framework do you use to ensure your sustainability disclosures and reports are according to regulation? So a little bit more technical.
Yeah, okay, fine. So for our scope 1 and 2 emissions, we collate all the data together every month, and it's a painful process, but it's absolutely necessary. And every year we get that audited and certified by an organisation called Planet Mark, and they provide our certification. But the reason that we chose them is because of the amount of engagement and communication they do. We don't get back just a list of numbers. We get back a real insight and people that we can work with to understand how we can kind of communicate that across the business. The downside of it is we know so much now about our scope 1 and 2 that, for example, there are there are 3 people in this organisation and that are buyers, and that means that they buy the fuel for the forklift trucks that are going around moving materials around our site so that it's in the right place for the guys to build it, so they don't have to carry everything everywhere. So really important job. What that means for those poor 3 people is that they get the brunt of everything because they're responsible for 75% of our carbon emissions. And that when you understand in a business that that's their job, and they know what the output of that is, it really changes how you talk to them about it and what they try and do about it as well. Before, I've never really got a grasp of that. I've just gone, okay, well, that's just something that we do as a business. We have to have forklift trucks. But when you realise, there's only one person in the business that's ordering all of this stuff, that's the person that, poor people, they feel very guilty about it. But, actually, as a result, we've trialled loads of alternative fuel sources. We've got new technology that tells us if someone's unplugged a seatbelt or if they've left it idling, or, loads of sort of cool information. So, going back to the report. So the question here, we meet the standards for the UN's Race to Zero initiative, and that sets some really strict guidelines on what we commit to. So a 50% reduction by 2030, and how we do it, and then that is audited by Planet Mark. And then our scope 3 currently isn't audited. We're still going through that process, like I said, about actually talking to those suppliers and making sure it's accurate rather than just putting out a number that doesn't mean anything. And then for our embodied carbon, that commitment kicks in 2025, and we're currently looking at 2 different certification schemes to try and make sure that we do it in a way that is easy to understand for everyone. So, I said about that commitment that we've got that's about delivering homes that are net zero. All of the other house builders that have got similar commitments, they set it based on their planning application date. The problem with that is there can be about 10 years between you submit a planning application date and you actually hand those homes over. And we all know what it's like in terms of greenwash, trying to understand which companies are good and which are not. But we decided to change our commitment so that it was about, if we are handing over a set of keys to a customer from 2025, that house will be zero carbon. So the line in the sand is those houses appearing, which makes it so definitive. And yes, it's been really complicated working back from that, trying to figure out, okay, well, then when will we start building it? When will we design it? When will we submit planning applications? So therefore, what do we need to say in those planning applications? Trying to figure that out has been really difficult. But actually for us, having that line in the sand of, it's going to get to 2025 and every single house that we're handing over is going to be zero carbon, whereas at the moment we're kind of 50-50. Some of them are old applications, some of them are new ones. That's fine, but I think that's the important thing. No matter what standard or framework that you use, no matter how your reporting is, it's got to be really clear to customers so that there's no confusion about what you are about and what you're delivering.
Have you found that the reporting for this has gotten easier as you've developed processes and expectations around it? Like once you kind of get through the initial learning hurdles and changes?
Yeah, definitely. And internally mainly. So as much as possible, we try and work it in with our financial system, the way that the invoices are processed, for example, so that it's almost automatic coming to us. So the most carbon intensive things, or the ordering of that gas oil or the white diesel for our construction sites, that is entered at invoice stage. It comes to us immediately. So by building in with that the way that I used to do it in a previous company is that we would wait for the fuel to be delivered. We would have the receipt. It would be in the site office. Then once a month that would get scanned and put in an Excel document, and then I would do that at the end of. I would review that at the end of the following month, and trying to cut down that time, that the time for me, the time for the site manager, the time for the contractor, the ability to get that wrong or for an invoice to go or a receipt to go missing. It's just trying to implement it alongside financial processes in the business is definitely the right way to go.
And my last follow up on that, but has that affected the decision making process as well? Just having that short lag time.
Yeah, and that short lead time means that because we committed to make a 5% reduction in our carbon emissions every single year, then like Earth Overshoot Day, when we've used up all of our resources and we start depleting nature's resources, we've kind of got the same thing for our carbon budget, is that I know when we're getting close to that 5%, and then I can go, look, guys, you've got no choice. You're either going to spend money on more carbon offsetting and not meet our commitment, or you're going to have to spend money on a different type of fuel. And when it gets close to that point, I can give them the heads up. They can feel like they're in control of the decision. And then I think we trialed something like 13,000 litres. And it sounds great, like we chose to do it, but we had to do it because we had a huge amount of construction sites starting, and that's when you use the most amount of fuel because you're out there digging lots of holes. So they kind of had to do it because we had the power, we had the information that gave them the power to do it.
Awesome.
Fantastic discussion. Again, I could listen to you guys talk for hours. Well, this is our last question from the audience. And Josie, I think that you'll have some good advice and possibly some passion for this question. It's what would be your advice, apart from being passionate about it, to pursue a career within the sustainability sector, specifically for graduates or people considering a career change? How can they move into doing something closer to what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, what's quite interesting is that there are more courses available than there were when I started, which is great. It gives you way more flexibility. What we also know is that there's a huge array of like chief sustainability officers in organisations. Even in the construction sector, there are a few of these roles kicking around, rather than heads of sustainability or a sustainability person that sits in the corner of the office that no one talks to. Like, it's just changed so dramatically that there's so many more opportunities to learn how to do things differently. And I think that's what you've got to always be aware of. Is I did a civil engineering course, which is very much, dirt, water, air, and concrete, which is the one I scored highest in, which is ridiculous that I now tackle embodied carbon. But and then I went into the construction sector. There was a real risk that I would just get this tunnel vision of, well, yes, the company I work for is good in comparison to other construction companies. That you need to kind of forget that and go, if you ever feel a bit stagnant, that you're not making the progress that you thought you would, go on Eventbrite, join the most random sustainability event you can find. There's some really cool ones like People Planet Pint. I've been to terrarium workshops. I've been to London Fashion Week, all sorts of stuff. Just find something that is anything to do with sustainability, but not in your industry. That's the biggest thing is don't get the tunnel vision, don't get carbon tunnel vision where you just think that's the only thing that we need to focus on, because you'll forget about people. Just go and attend some really, really random events. That's what I would say.
You hit on a huge topic there too, which is comparing what you're doing against your peers. And it's like measuring ourselves against how everybody else is doing, and because we're doing better than our competitors are, then we must be doing a good thing. But looking at things in the grander scheme of things, and what are our actual targets, like what do we need to hit for us to meet these worldwide targets that we need to hit, and just being a little bit better than our competitors is not going to be the path that's going to get us there.
And also, you probably won't ever do anything differently to the way that they're struggling to do it as well. That's the other thing, is you don't know what you don't know until you go and find it. So definitely go and find some random stuff to go and learn about and inspire yourself. But the other one is just pure stubbornness, right? They said it was passion. I think it's just a bit of radical candor, a bit of honesty to be able to say, this is how I feel about it, and this is what I believe is needed, and being strong enough to be able to say that in a business.
It's the foundation of innovation. I love it.
That's right. Well, we have our question for you, a little bit more of a general, so you can take this. If you had the power to change any one thing in the industry, what would it be?
So I would always change policy. It's like the most boring thing, policy, but you know what it means? It means everyone has to do it. And there's something so powerful about that when there are, we've got changes, we've got the future home standard, which will make homes more energy efficient. And we're already seeing the same kickback that we saw in 2016 against that policy change. And, when different local authorities that have a more sustainable agenda push things forward and try and do things better in their area, you get house builders complain that, I have to do something over here and then 5 miles over there it's something entirely different. It's so confusing. So if we just all had to do it, it would be so much easier for everybody. And that's why sometimes we're really open about how we achieve things. And I'll take anyone round a development and show them what's different and show them designs and talk to them about things, because it's great that Thakeham are doing some amazing things. But what we're really driven by is trying to make the whole industry do something different. And sometimes I just think forcing them is the easiest way, We don't want to leave anyone behind. It needs to be everyone that's doing this, a consistent approach backed by post-occupancy evaluation, driving it by how residents feel about those houses as well as how they actually perform in real life. Some really strong policies.
That's great. Here in North America, we don't have quite as, we're not as advanced policy-wise as a lot of, especially our viewing audience that's viewing in from Europe. So I can totally agree with you. We could definitely use a lot more policy here. And like you say, it's, forcing that change is sometimes what it takes. Well, we have another question. This is from last month's guest. And he asked you, how can we unlock green finance to make life cycle assessments more accessible?
So for me, this is all about mortgages. Yeah, that's how I apply it to my business. I'd love there to be more access to green mortgages so that actually those homes were more accessible. And, accessible is one thing, affordable kind of fits into that same, bracket really, that the most sustainable homes should need to be owned by the people that need that financial security most. And I think the financial industry has a huge opportunity to drive the industry forward to making more sustainable homes. So the problem with that is that how you certify it. So life cycle assessments is a great way. So are the EPCs, so the energy performance certificate on the kind of, I guess, the running of that house, the operational energy of that house. That's another thing that green finance could use. At the moment, they've only used the EPCs. I don't think any of them have looked at life cycle assessments. But for me, being able to offer, yes, a house is more expensive because it's more sustainable. It has air source heat pumps and solar panels on. It's marginally expensive. It's not hugely, but it is more expensive. If we can make that financially better for a customer because they get a lower mortgage rate because it's had a life cycle assessment, like that makes it so much more accessible for people. So yeah, for me, it's through green mortgages.
That's fantastic. I think that's a great way to look at it from more of an individual perspective too, not just companies getting this green finance, but how can we get, individual people to get green finance as well. So now here's your chance to challenge our next guest. Our next guest who will be joining us in September is Amy Leadham. And what question would you like to ask her?
So Atelier 10 are great. They're, really cool company, and they're a global business. So I thought I'd ask them a question that kind of relates to that, because I've spoken a lot about the reality and changing the reality for people that live on the residents that live in our communities. So my question is, do you talk to your clients about sustainability in the same way, or do you approach it differently in different countries? That's what I'd be really interested to hear about.
That's great. I can't wait to pose that question to her in a month and see what her answer is. Well, that brings us to the end of our show. So I just want to say thank you so much, Josie, for joining us. Thank you, Travis, as always, for doing such a great job hosting. a few quick items for our audience before we let you go. You can find more information about embodied carbon policies at oneclicklca.com/library. We have a whole host of information for you there. You can also find more information about sustainability in general and other resources on our website. We have some free training coming up. And sorry, I'm jumping ahead of the slides, but this slide here, you can see various pages on our website, but you can always just go to oneclicklca.com and search for, we've just got a ton of resources for you, educational resources, our blog and our white papers and all that. And then we also have some live free training. So our construction LCA boot camp is coming up in September. That's going to be September 11th through 15th. And our EPD boot camp is in October. Both of these are free training events. So you can sign up at academy.oneclicklca.com to get involved, get registered for those, and have a really great educational week learning about these products. And then our next screen, we've got the contact information for both Josie and Travis. I'm sure a lot of you are going to want to keep the conversation going. I wish we could have kept it going for another hour or two. So if you want to reach out, ask questions, find out more about different ways that you can get ahead of the curve, get ahead of the policies for sustainability, definitely reach out to Josie and Travis. And last is another reminder that we have Carbon Experts Live every month. Next month, we'll be featuring Amy Leadham with Atelier 10, and that's going to be on September 13th, which is a Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. So you can go ahead to our website, oneclicklca.com/carbonexpertslive. You can register there, and it will show you when that webinar is going to be in your own time zone, because I know we have people joining from all over the world. So again, Josie, thank you so much. Travis, do you have any last items before we sign off for today?
I have two. Josie, just a quick question. Are there any programs or anything that you're doing that you want to plug before we wrap out?
Well, one to look out for. So we talked a lot about biodiversity, and we've got a document coming out soon called The Blueprint for Wilder Living, which is all about how anyone that plays a part in creating places can make sure that those go beyond biodiversity net gain, not get that tunnel vision, but look at all of the other amazing ways that you can affect nature recovery and connect people with the nature on their doorsteps. So look out for that soon.
Can you send that to us when you release it, and we'll make sure we share it in our network as well.
Will do.
Yeah. And last thing, if anybody has any topics or people that you'd like to see us interview, please send a message to hello@oneclicklca.com. That's it for me.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again so much, everyone, for joining us today. And we will see you next month at the next episode of Carbon Experts Live. Bye.